Hey everyone, Squee here, and welcome back to Chapter 2 of Arena. I just wanted to say real quick before we get started. After this episode, I plan on doing a video response, like I said I was going to do at the beginning, because I think between the prologue, Chapter 1, and this chapter that I'm about to read, you'll get a decent idea of the writing style I intend to portray in this story. So I think it'd be a good time to answer any questions. One thing I do want to point out, I've been getting really positive reactions to the story, which is fantastic, but I've been getting very unhelpful, I guess is the word. It's weird because I don't want to sound ungrateful at all. But like when you just say, "Man, I love this. That's fantastic. I'm glad you love it," but that doesn't really tell me much. I'm hoping to use you guys to better my writing, etc. So I would love it if you guys would leave comments, and some of you have, and it's really nice. Like, I love it, and this is why, or I think you could approve on this, especially now that I'm going to do after this episode a response. So when you leave comments below, if you're willing, I would very much enjoy more in-depth or for you to ask questions about my writing style, my thought process, how I wrote, etc., etc., etc. Even stories about the world, as long as you understand that there'd be a lot that obviously I'm not going to answer if it's answered later on down the road. But something more than just, I love this story. I appreciate that. It gives me warm and fuzzies. It really does. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really help me improve as a writer. So, yeah, enough of that. And let's get into chapter 2. Chapter 2. A Battle for the Ages. Jonas sat in a plush chair, idly swinging his legs as he watched Fel pace back and forth. She was muttering to herself and shaking her head. Jonas stared at her curiously, not quite sure what to do. Finally, Fel turned to Yona with an angry face. "Why wouldn't he let me go? He has always let me watch his matches. He knows how much I worry about him." Yona shrunk back from the verbal assault, and Fel, realizing what she had done, blushed and hung her head. "Sorry, Yona," Fel murmured. "It's not your fault. I just don't understand what's going on. What's so different about today?" Yona looked up at the ceiling and thought. "Maybe it's because the fight's to the death? You said you worry about him. Maybe he knew that you would be too worried about the match since he could die in it." Yona looked back down at Fel to see her staring at him wide-eyed with her mouth hanging open. "You didn't know." Yona frowned, feeling that he had just said something he shouldn't have. A small gasp that sounded more like a squeak escaped Fel's throat as the terror of what Yona had said set in. "To the death," Fel whispered. "Oh no, why would he do such a thing?" Yona leaned back in the chair casually. Who knows? Sometimes arena champions fight other champions when the two countries disagree about something. Fel tried several times to speak before words came out. "How can you be so calm? Jax could be killed." Yona laughed. "It's Jax. Not in a million years could anyone take him down." Fel looked at the ground. "You think so?" Yona hopped off the chair and put his hands on Fel's shoulders. "You know Jax better than anyone. Do you really think there's someone out there that he can't beat?" After a few seconds, Fel looked up hopefully. "No, I don't. Do you really think he'll be okay?" "If you're so worried, why don't we go watch the match?" Yona grinned. But Jax said stay here," Fel stuttered. Yona's grin widened. "Do you always do what Jax tells you to?" "Well, yes, of course I do," Fel said hesitantly. Yona frowned at the unexpected answer. "Oh, well, stop that." "Stop that?" Fel asked, confused. "You want to see the match, right?" Yona asked, and Fel immediately nodded. "Then let's go watch the match. What is worse, not knowing what happened, or having Jax be a little angry that you didn't stay here?" After a few moments, Fel smiled. "Okay, let's go." "Yahoo!" Yona pumped his fist in the air and rushed out the door with Fel right behind him. After a few steps, Yona slowed down and then stopped altogether. "What's wrong?" Fel asked. I I don't know where to go," Yona admitted sheepishly. Fel giggled and grabbed Yona's hand as she ran down the hall. The two children ran down the corridors of the arena, hiding whenever someone passed and laughing to themselves the entire time. Eventually, Fel led Yona to an empty room with nothing but a bench and several windows looking out over the center of the arena. It was below the stands, and Yona could hear the muffled cheering of the crowd above him. As they walked up to the windows, Fel explained that this was an old observation room that the arena fighters used to watch other matches. A new one was built several years ago, however, and this one was never used anymore. She said that she still loved this room because it was level with the arena floor and she could see the match up close. Suddenly, the muffled cheering above them grew louder, and the two children turned their attention outside the windows. The match was about to start. Jax walked up the ramp and out to the center of the arena. He looked around as he let his eyes adjust to the sunlight. The center of the arena was enormous. The combat area was a perfect circle. 50 men could lay down head to toe and still not stretch from one wall to the opposite one. All around, the stands of the arena rose into the sky. The cheers of thousands of onlookers echoed endlessly around Jax. Magic hummed in the air as powerful spells surrounded the combat area at all times. Their purpose ranged from protecting the audience to changing the terrain of the combat area. The fighter circle, as it was called, could be changed to fit any landscape. Combatants could fight in the forest one day and a barren desert the next. Right now, however, the entire circle was empty, save for loose dirt that carpeted the floor. No fighter this day could claim victory due to some trick of the environment. Cheers and cries of "Jax!" rebounded off the walls, but Jax did not even hear them. His focus was on the man walking towards him from the opposite gate. The man was dressed in solid black. Leather, the shade of midnight, covered every inch of his body from the neck down. The only color came from the inside of his cloak and a metal breastplate strapped to his chest. Both were crimson red. Twin short swords were attached to his hips, their silver hilts gleaming in the sun. Matching silver hair flowed down his back and framed his handsome face. What drew Jax's attention, though, were the man's eyes. Red orbs that, for all their sparkle, seemed colder than the heart of an iceberg. Slowly, the two men walked to the center of the arena and stopped when they were about 20 paces from each other. The cheers died down and eventually silence filled the arena. The two men stared at each other, searching for weaknesses in their opponent. Jax was the first to speak. "Some day, huh?" Jax said with a smile. When the man across from him did not react, Jax continued in a more serious tone. "I have heard of you, Sin. I do not know how much is to be believed, but I have heard that you're an intelligent man. Too intelligent to kill over a dead piece of land. The squabbles of governments mean nothing in this ring. Let us make a pact that no one need lose their life this day." Sin stared at Jax for a long time, and the crowd began to feel uncomfortable in the silence. Finally, Sin spoke. "I have heard of you as well. They call you the Dragon Wizard. Why is that?" Jax grinned. "Guess you'll just have to find out." Sin's expression never changed. "Make no mistake, Dragon Wizard. I will kill you." Jax's grin disappeared and his eyes narrowed. "I will kill you," Sin repeated. "Not over a piece of land, or because a government commands it. I will kill you because you're an Enloran. You're a human-loving traitor to your people, and I will hand down judgment for your crimes." Jax slowly reached down and loosened the ties to the pouch holding his small white stones. "Very well. If that is how it is to be, may the gods have pity on your soul." Sin snarled, "Save your pity and surrender your life." Sin's hands moved in a blur. His index fingers traced symbols in the air with blinding speed. Black energy flowed from his fingertips and took the shape of the symbols he drew. It looked as if Sin were writing in the air with black ink. Jax jumped back to gain some distance and pulled out a white stone. The black symbols then sank into the ground like water sinks into dry dirt. A split second later, 4 black tentacles erupted from the ground behind Sin. They writhed and swayed sickeningly, as if they were alive. At a wave of Sin's hand, the tentacles lashed out at Jax with surprising speed. Jax had to twirl out of the way as the tentacles whipped into the ground where he had been. They stretched out as they chased Jax across the circle. As fast as the tentacles were, however, Jax was faster. Leaping, twisting, and flipping, Jax stayed one step ahead of the tentacles and tried to find an opening to attack Sin. Jax quickly realized that he could not dodge all 4 tentacles forever and started to chant under his breath as he continued to evade the deadly attacks. After spinning under one particularly close attack, Jax crouched down and pulled a handful of stones out and added them to the one he had been chanting to. Seeing an apparent opening, Sin stretched out his hand and all 4 tentacles came crashing down towards Jax. Launching himself straight up, Jax twisted in mid-flight and flung the stones one by one into the air. The stones glowed yellow and hung in the air as if suspended by a string. They formed a zigzagged line that stretched out over Sin and began to change shape. They seemed to melt into foot-long, flat discs. Sin, not sure what Jax was up to, did not intend to let him finish the spell. He raised his arms above his head and the 4 tentacles suddenly shot upwards towards Jax. They twisted around each other and stretched around Jax, trying to enclose him. Jax somehow flipped his body so that he dove through a hole in the tentacle prison and tumbled to the ground. But the attack had worked. Jax had apparently lost his concentration, and the discs stopped glowing. Cursing, Jax hurled the last 2 stones at Sin's head. Sin calmly moved his head to the side as the stones whistled past him. With a smile, Jax brought the index and middle finger of his right hand upright in front of his face and shouted, "Pondis funim!" The 2 stones that had flown past Sin suddenly glowed with a brilliant yellow light and curved around to the sides of the 4 tentacles. Sin turned his head in time to see the stones shoot out ropes of yellow light. They coiled around the tips of the black tentacles and pulled them apart. Each stone pulled the closest 2 tentacles to split it down the middle. With a snarl, Sin swung his attention back to the front to deflect whatever attack was coming, but Jax was nowhere to be seen. Confusion crossed Sin's face until a sound above him drew his gaze upward. Jax was skipping across the discs he had thrown into the air. He bounded from one to the next as if he were running on solid ground. Before Sin could react, Jax had crossed above him and dropped down behind the surprised warrior. As Jax fell to the ground behind Sin, he drew his Heartstone sword and spun in the air to attack him. The sound of metal on stone clanged across the arena. Surprise shone briefly in Jax's eyes as Sin had managed to draw both of his short swords and spin around in time to catch the attack. For a moment, the 2 champions paused, looking into each other's eyes. Silence filled the arena as the audience sat in stunned silence at the speed and skill of the warriors. Yona and Fel stared wide-eyed at the entire display without saying a word. The only sound that could be heard were soft thuds as the discs Jax had skipped across turned back into simple white stones and plopped into the dirt. As suddenly as the pause had started, it ended. Jax pressed forward and launched a series of attacks at Sin's torso. Sin backpedaled as he parried one attack after another. Stone rung on metal again and again as the 2 masters danced around each other. Sin used his right blade to deflect one of the attacks and stepped back with his right foot at the same time. He then turned his body and used all his strength to push Jax's sword out to his right. The momentum pulled Jax towards Sin's right side before he could catch himself. Impossibly fast, Sin reversed the grip of his left blade and plunged it towards Jax's defenseless chest. Just before the attack struck home, Jax brought his knee up against the flat of Sin's blade and knocked it harmlessly above his shoulder. Stepping forward with the same leg, Jax slammed an elbow into Sin's face, forcing him to stumble back and giving Jax time to regain his balance. Immediately, Jax pressed the attack again, using the momentum from one swing to lead into another. The Heartstone sword felt amazingly light in his hands, and he was able to keep pace with the smaller swords of his foe. Spinning around Sin's left side, Jax swung at the exposed knee, forcing Sin to block low with his left blade. Sin reached over with his right blade and began to stab down towards Jax's head. With his free hand, Jax reached into a pouch and flung a stone into Sin's face. It had no magic spell on it, but the simple shock and pain caused Sin to stumble for a moment, and Jax swung his sword down across Sin's chest. The Heartstone blade cut through the metal chestplate as if it were paper. A frantic hop backwards kept the wound from being deep, but blood seeped into the cloth around the chestplate. Jax did not give Sin a chance to recover. He issued a flurry of blows so fierce that Sin was forced back on his heels. Desperately, Sin brought both his feet up and launched himself off of Jax's chest. Jax was pushed back by the blow as the wind was knocked out of him. Sin flew backwards and flung both of his blades spinning end over end high into the air. Before he had even touched the ground, Sin was drawing black symbols in the air. They sank into the dirt as Sin landed on his back and rolled to his feet. Catching his breath, Jax started to move towards Sin again, but paused mid-step. Two forms began to rise out of the ground between Sin and Jax. The shapes slowly formed into two exact copies of Sin, save for the fact that they were black as shadows. Where the face should be, there was only blank darkness. The two forms raised their right hands in unison, and each caught one of the two blades that were spinning back down to the ground. "Well, that's different," Jax said to himself as the two shadows pointed their blades towards him. In the blink of an eye, they sprinted towards him, circling to each side of Jax. Understanding the danger of taking on two opponents with that kind of speed, a change seemed to come over Jax. His body relaxed and his face became expressionless. As the two forms closed to his sides, he exhaled slowly and brought his sword up in front of him. Then he moved. Jax launched himself at the shadow to his right and dove under its swing. As he dove, he sliced his sword into the shadow's hip. It slid through the shadow with no resistance and causing no damage. He rolled to his feet, but both shadows were upon him. Cutting back and forth, the two shadows worked in unison. They attacked from different directions, probing for weaknesses. They thrusted and slashed at impossible angles so quickly their blades were nothing but a silver blur. Jax parried every blow. He was perfection. Every block was precise, every counter perfect. The entire arena stared in awe as Jax fought off the two shadows. As dangerous as these shadows were, however, Jax knew they were not the real threat. He glanced over at Sin and saw that he was furiously drawing more symbols for a spell. He had no idea what the spell was, but judging by the number of symbols and the amount of time it was taking, it was big. Jax knew every second he wasted fighting these shadows, Sin was drawing closer to finishing his spell. But the shadows were so fast that Jax did not have time to attack. He needed time to chant a spell, but with their speed, he would never be able to finish before they cut him down. An idea flashed into Jax's mind, and he grabbed a stone out of one of the pouches with his free hand. Blocking one shadow's attack and bending over backwards to dodge the others, Jax quickly chanted a minor spell and threw the stone at the ground, shouting, "Air Spiritus!" A blast of wind knocked Jax 15 feet into the air. The shadows stared up at him with blank faces as the blasts of air passed through their incorporeal bodies. Taking advantage of the time he had just given himself, Jax threw his sword point first into the ground and drew out 2 more white stones. As he fell back to the earth, he chanted under his breath. When he landed on the ground, he slammed both hands, each with a stone, into the ground and yelled, "Dente Draco!" Brilliant yellow light in the shape of dragons flared out from each stone. The dragons were long and snake-like, with huge maws lined with teeth. They wove in and out of the ground as if it were merely water. Before the shadows could react, each dragon had coiled around one of their legs and snaked up their chests. The dragons twirled around the shadows' heads and clamped their giant maws over the formless faces. The light from the dragons grew in intensity until the dragons and shadows exploded in a blinding flash of yellow light and shadow. Leaving the now plain stones on the ground, Jack stood up and faced Sin. "Nicely done, wizard," Sin mocked as the symbols he drew began to swirl above his head. "But not fast enough. Behold!" The symbols melded into a gigantic black orb. The pitch-black sphere was twice as big as a man and seemed to spin as it sat above Sin's head. "Well, that's not good," Jax whispered to himself. "Your life ends here, along with your sanity." Sin stretched forward a hand and the globe sped towards Jax with surprising speed for its size. Jax quickly whipped out another stone and chanted as he raced forward 3 steps. He slammed the stone into the ground and again yelled, "Dente Draco!" A yellow dragon snaked out from the stone and shot towards the black globe. It connected with the sphere and simply disappeared into its depths. "Definitely not good," Jax said as he dove out of the globe's path. The globe seemed to spin in place for a second and then shot after Jax. It was all Jax could do to stay away from it. Its speed was amazing, and it chased Jax across the arena. Jax tried to draw out more stones for spells, but the orb was too fast, and a handful of stones were tossed to the side as Jax frantically rolled out of the way. He sprinted away from the orb as fast as he could, bringing forth more stones and chanting as he went. The incredibly fast orb cut him off, and Jax skid to a halt. More precious stones fell to the ground as Jax again barely dodged the orb. Jax began to realize that he was not going to be able to escape this orb. Desperately, he sprinted for his sword that still lay embedded in the ground at the center of the arena. He pulled out one of his last stones as he reached the blade, but before he could do anything, the orb descended upon him. Silence followed, as only the soft whirling of the orb could be heard in the arena. Fel let out a small gasp and clutched at the windowsill. Even Yona bit his lip as he began to worry that Jax was not unbeatable. Seconds passed, and nothing happened. The orb just sat there and spun. The crowd began to murmur nervously. In the fighting circle, Sin calmly retrieved his blades and slid them into their sheaths. Then he just stood there, watching the orb and smiling to himself. Jax felt nothing. He did not feel the ground under his feet nor the wind in his hair. He felt as if he was suspended in nothingness. He began to wonder if he was dead. Abruptly, light exploded around him. The world was a blur of shifting colors and pictures. Slowly, the world focused, and Jax found himself standing in front of 2 elderly elves. "Mother? Father?" Jax tried to say, but instead he said, "Father, I made it into the arena. I passed the trials." Suddenly, Jax realized he was reliving a memory from his past. He knew this memory well. He had just been accepted as an arena fighter and told his parents the news. They had been so proud of him. His mother had made his favorite meal, and his father had stayed up all night with him, talking about the glories Jax would achieve in the ring. Something was wrong, though. His father did not look proud. He looked angry. Rage twisted his features. "Father?" Jax asked, confused. "How could you?" Jax's father spat. "We told you not to go to the arena. We begged you." Jax shrank back in confusion. No. You told me... Jax's father pointed at his mother. "Look what you've done!" Jax's eyes moved to his mother. She sat with her head slumped down. Her skin was pale and cold-looking. Her wrists were open, and the last of her blood was draining from her veins. Horror gripped Jax. "Mother! How? I don't understand." Jax's father stood up. "You did this. I begged you not to go. After you left, your mother could not bear the shame. She ended her life rather than suffer the monster you had become." Jax fell to the floor, tears streaming down his face. "Mother, Jax's father drew out a sword. "Don't worry, son. I will send you to her." Jax shrieked as his enraged father cut into him. Pain and confusion exploded in Jax's head. Then the world was swirling again. Jax crouched on his hands and knees, panting and trying to figure out what had happened. That was not what happened, was it? Did Mother kill herself because of me? Jax thought. As Jax tried to piece together truth from lies, the world slowed again. This time, he was standing on the tallest tower of the arena. Selena stood next to him, and they stared off into the sunset. "So, you are the arena champion, huh?" Selena said sarcastically. "I am," Jax replied confidently. "It is an odd feeling, knowing you have fulfilled one of your dreams." "One of them?" Selena turned to him. "What is the other, I wonder?" Jax simply stared softly at Selena. "No," Selena said after a moment. "I am an arena fighter. I will always be one. My life has no room for other things." Jax nodded sadly and stared off into the sunset. Selena stared at Jax for a long time. Unexpectedly, Jax felt Selena's head on his shoulder. "My life does have room for a sunset, though. One simple, perfect sunset." Jax smiled warmly and put his arm around Selena. All of a sudden, Jax felt a sharp pain in his stomach. He looked down to see Selena holding a knife that she had plunged into his abdomen. Something was not right. Jax looked at Selena with eyes wide from pain and shock. Her face was twisted in rage, and she stabbed him again and again. Jax slowly slid to the ground. "No," Jax thought. "No, please, don't." Selena reached down and drew her knife across Jax's throat, and the world went black. Jax lay on the ground panting and babbling to himself. His mind was cracking. He could no longer tell what were his real memories. He felt himself going mad and tried desperately to cling to his sanity. Again, the world started to swirl. Jax could not handle it anymore. He could not take another painful memory. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would all go away. Slowly, he opened his eyes and found that he was standing in a general store. He was paying for a sweet-smelling candy. Jax instantly knew this memory and shuddered. "No, please," Jax sobbed into his own mind. "Please, not this. Anything but this." Jax felt something pulling at his leg and looked down. Fell's big blue eyes smiled up at him. She was no taller than his knee and had just learned to walk. She held up an outstretched hand for the candy. "No," Jax pleaded with his own mind. "Not Fell. I can't take this." Jax handed Fell the sweet candy, and she shoved it into her mouth. As she chewed, she smiled up at him and closed her eyes in joy. Jax waited for something to happen. He waited for her face to contort in rage or for her to hurt him. He could not bear the thought of Fell turning on him, and he knew that he was going to lose whatever sanity he had left. Jax waited, but nothing happened. Fell just swallowed the candy and hugged Jack's leg, giggling. There was no rage, no horrible twist, just a smiling, loving girl. It was as if whatever magic gripped Jax's mind had no power over the smiling elf girl, or that, even as a memory, she could never show anything but love for Jax. Slowly, Jax's mind began to calm. He lost himself in Fell's smile. He let it guide him back to reality. He began to remember what was real and what was fake. His parents were proud of him and died at very old ages. Selena had stayed in his arms until sunset before parting. And Fell? Fell had simply asked for another sweet candy. Jax opened his eyes. He remembered that he was being held inside a black orb. He realized that it had been twisting his memories to break his sanity. Afterwards, Sin would simply have to kill the broken lunatic the orb left behind. He shuddered when he realized how close he had just come to dying. Not for the first time, Jax offered a silent prayer to the gods for bringing Fel into his life. His subconscious mind could not even comprehend the idea of Fel hurting him, and had rejected the magic. Jax concentrated on his surroundings. His body was suspended in the air, and his arms were stretched out to his sides as though he were bound to a dungeon wall. Slowly, he became aware of the stone in his left hand. He struggled with all his might to pull his left hand to his lips. He chanted something under his breath and let the stone drop. It fell to his feet and slowly expanded into a huge platform below him. Outside, Sin could tell something was wrong. Jax had not lost his sanity. In fact, he felt more focused than ever. Sin was about to weave another spell when the ground began to glow yellow. Sin looked in amazement at the dirt. A giant yellow magic circle covered the floor of the fighter circle, with a black orb at its center. How? Sin asked in disbelief. He could not have set up a magic circle while inside the orb. Sin's eyes suddenly grew wide with shock. He noticed that there were stones everywhere on the ground feeding the circle. Sin realized that every stone had been placed on purpose. The stones that Jax ran across in the sky, the stones that he had supposedly lost while running, and even the stone that had been flung in his face had all been placed exactly where they needed to be to form a magic circle. The clever wizard had even let the orb catch him at the magic circle's center. Sin's mind reeled. What kind of fighter could not only plan so far ahead, but create an entire magic circle without anyone noticing by hiding it with other attacks? The circle grew brighter, and beams of yellow light shot out from the stones on the ground into the black orb. Beam after beam bored into the blackness until it began to crack. Lines of yellow light cut across the inky black surface until the entire orb was ripped apart in a giant flash of light. Sin had to shield his eyes from the explosion, and when he looked at where the orb had been, his face was filled with horror. Jax stood on a glowing yellow platform suspended a foot off the ground. Rising up out of the platform was a massive dragon. It resembled the earlier dragons, but was many times larger and as thick as a man's torso. It curled around Jax and rested its head on his shoulder. The dragon hissed, and yellow smoke escaped its mouth. Jax, his face set like stone, stared at Sin silently for a moment, before reaching out his hand and saying, "Draco Exodus." The dragon roared and shot at Sin. Sin desperately wove symbols and barely formed a shield in front of him before the dragon crashed into it. Sin and his shield were pushed back. Dirt flew up as Sin was forced backwards by the powerful dragon. He slammed into the wall behind him so hard that he coughed up blood. The dragon roared, and the wall started to crack as it pushed Sin even harder. He knew he was about to die if he did not do something. Sin screamed in rage, and small black tendrils grew from the edges of the shield. The tendrils wrapped themselves around the shining dragon and began to squeeze it. Still, the dragon pushed, and the black shield began to crack. Then something snapped in Sin. His body began to radiate black energy, and he screamed a blood-chilling cry of rage and desperation. The whole arena seemed to grow darker as Sin tapped into the limits of his power. Slowly, the tendrils began to constrict the dragon, and with a final scream of rage, the dragon and the tendrils exploded. The entire arena was blinded for several seconds by the mighty blast. The spectators sat in stunned wonder at the battle unfolding before them. No one moved. No one dared to speak. When the dust cleared, Sin was leaning up against the stone wall, panting and wiping blood from his mouth. Jax stood on the ground behind the Heartstone sword, staring at Sin. His face was one of quiet determination. He drew his sword out of the ground and pulled his last stone from its pouch. "You are out of energy, Sin," Jax said coldly. "It's time to end this." Jax chanted to the stone, and then held it to the sword blade. The stone seemed to sink into the blade. Slowly, the sword began to seep with a brown liquid that seemed to be coming from the blade itself. Sin just stared at the blade, unable to refute Jax's claim. Slowly, he pushed himself off the wall and drew his blades. With a cry of rage, Sin charged Jax. This time, however, Sin was hurt and exhausted. Jax easily knocked away the clumsy attacks and forced Sin back with his own counters. Every time the blades touched, brown liquid would fly onto Sin. Slowly, Sin became aware that it was getting harder to move. The brown liquid was hardening into rock. Desperately, Sin jumped back and dropped his swords. He frantically wove symbols into the air, but the liquid quickly turned to solid brown stone, and as the symbols sunk into the ground, Sin became unable to move anything but his right arm. "It is over," Jax stated as he sheathed his sword. "You think so?" Sin snickered. "You cannot move or draw symbols. I could kill you at a whim," Jax said calmly. "You are indeed powerful, like they said you were, Dragon Wizard," Sin smiled. "You know what else they say? They say that you have a soft spot for children, that you let them watch your matches. They say that you would do anything for them." Sin pointed over to the side wall of the arena. Jax's gaze followed Sin's hand, and his eyes widened in horror. The last symbol Sin had drawn had not been meant for Jax. In the observation room, Yona hung suspended in air, tangled in a black tentacle that had risen up out of the ground below his feet. It was slowly choking him, and Yona's eyes were wide with terror as he struggled to breathe. Fel sat in the corner horrified and crying Jax's name. "So tell me, Dragon Wizard," Sin laughed, "what are you willing to do to save your precious pets?" Well, that's it for Chapter 2. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The next video I should be releasing should be a response to any questions or comments that you guys leave. So please leave questions and comments. I hope you're enjoying the story. By now, you should have an idea of the writing style I intend to have with this book. I am only about a third to halfway through Chapter 3, so it might be a bit before that one comes out. But I will get it out as soon as I can. So until then, everyone, take care, and I will see you guys later. Bye.